Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Awaludin Wisata. I'm the one from the group. The title of the material today is Reading the Philosophy of Education by John Kegel. First of all, we'll talk about the introduction. Reading philosophy is hard, okay? It's difficult. Simply because we are mainly not paying attention to a text that philosophy demands. The philosophy text is hard to understand. It's different than normal text. The text, the word, because mainly the philosophers wanted the reader to concerning some contentious issues. Simply, the philosophy text want the reader to think when the readers reading the text by the philosophers. So they want the reader to think about what the philosophers want to speak to the readers. That's why the philosophy text is hard. Okay, when it comes to reading philosophy concept with education, it will become more hard. The matter is made more difficult because you're not just from learning and reading some philosophy text, but you also reading philosophy text with education concern, and that is more difficult than a normal philosophy text. So philosophy of education mainly talking about the area of life. It's look like the morals. Okay. There are some of difficulty that maybe you'll find while learning philosophy of education. Let's talk here about the two recent facts about British education. The first concern, the West Dunbartonshire Literacy Initiative by Mackey in 2006, where it is claimed that in an educational deprived area of the country, a strategy has been designed that has been drastically reduced illiteracy and will in the near future eradicate completely. So literacy in our generation is getting really bad. It's maybe become eradicate completely in soon. The second concern, the recent publication, December 2008 of the year's League Table for Secondary School in England, where it is shown in terms of one measure that educational success attainment at GCSE and A level, the top state schools are approaching the achievement of the independent school. But there is a yawning chasm between the achievement of the independent school, between the achievement pupils in the school and the achievement of children attending school in the bottom half of the tables. Okay, from the quotation mark around upside, we're talking about the conclusion. The quotation marks around the text above indicate that both of those things may be matter of controversy. There may be some who will dispute whether the research report on the lack of tables are accurate, but give us the interesting and important aspect of our education system. The first show persistence feature of our education system. About 2,000% of the children do not learn to read at primary school. The second one is a show that taught some of our children do well in a secondary school. In terms of measure of educational achievement, many of them doing very badly. In a recent paper, a reading proponent of the views I wish to consider, Professor David Carr argues that notwithstanding any and all pressure to regard teaching in institutional and professional context as a form of technical or managerial expertise directed to specific social ends, neither teaching nor the moral end which it more widely serves seems reducible to practice in any socially defined sense. So it would be a mistake to think, given a proper understanding of teaching, that it might have to do with illiteracy of the attainment of 5A until C pass at GCSE level. The implicator here is that our focus, certainly as philosopher of education, should not be on the school, which may educate or not, but on those essential features of education itself, there is some argument. Some schools do not educate. People can be educated without going to school. Therefore, school have nothing to do with education, but there is no reason to not going to school. With that argument, they said the argument like it is possible to school have nothing to do with education, but that is wrong because we need school. Okay, maybe you can be a smart person without going to school, but school give you a degrees, give you a moral that you do not get when you're learning by yourself. So first of all, the conclusion of the introduction is reading philosophy education is hard, and education might be something that people not really understand what's the main reason of education it is, but education is one of the important thing in the world. So even though the literacy is getting really bad right now because of the generation, but I hope everyone will be getting rid. That's the main reason there. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
The distinction between the content and process of education and its institutional context causes problems and in other areas of education. So, for instance, in the last statement of aims for the national curriculum, there seems to be no attempt to distinguish between what the curriculum is designed to achieve and what the schools, independent of the curriculum, are supposed to achieve. But without such a distinction, we have the way of telling if something is going wrong and these aims are not being achieved. When the fault is, we simply cannot tell whether it is the curriculum and its design that has contributed to his failure, or the policies of the schools, or both. If a scholar seems to argue education is not about schooling, what is it supposed to be about? For Carr, education and teaching are essentially moral matters. They are areas in which some of the moral virtues are practiced, exemplified, and passed on. In an important sense, for Carr, all good education is moral education. Such facts seem completely irrelevant to Carr's description, and if teaching and education are about the exemplification and passing on of Carr's virtues, such thing can obviously be achieved independently of addressing concern either for literacy or for GCSE pass rates. Given that people can become fully moral individuals without being able to read or pass exams, one could, in Carr's term, be a completely successful teacher if there were no such education achievements. It might be the case that with a certain emphasis on the knowledge, passion, and enthusiasm for what is taught that figure in Carr's account, that such concern for achievement do become even for Carr the remit of the good teacher. So, for instance, when Robin Alexander suggests that teachers need to clarify their conception of good practice and to work with a notion that includes some reference to empirical evidence for effective teaching, Carr responds by accusing Alexander of having a technicist view of education which subordinates the value implicit within the education to a quasi-scientific methodology. Carr's concern seems to focus upon the interpersonal moral relationships present in teaching and learning, on how, in relating to a particular group of pupils, the teacher may be exemplifying some of the moral aspects of his or her character and therefore encouraging the growth of such characteristics within the pupils. But taken together, the Westhook Dunbar Townshire report and the secondary school results suggest that it is a realizable aspiration that we could eliminate failure in schools, but this in turn suggests that schools are not, although they could, fulfilling their primary purpose, and if this is the case, what we have here are profound cases of social injustice. But social injustice which are obscured rather than highlighted by the current type of analysis of education. This narrowness of focus concerning educational matters is not confined to Carr's writing. He is in many ways an exemplar of a certain type of contemporary practitioner of philosophy of education, who in reacting to attempt to present teaching and education as matters of technique, takes the emphasis too far in the other direction where few matters of fact or empirical investigation or questions of social policy have anything to do with education as properly understood. But such narrowness of focus has, for rather different reasons, always been present in British philosophy of education. If we look at the work of a figure who for many exemplified the beginnings of institutionalized philosophy of education in this country, R.S. Peters, we see the same narrowness of focus. It is at least arguable, and probably true, that modern philosophy of education is to be associated with the work Professor Peters, and that the key moment of such an association was the publication of his book Ethics and Education. Although Peters later changed many of the views that he expressed within that book, his work the provides an important the influential example of thinking about education. Peter was much concerned with the question of educational value, and in Ethics and Education he wrote that the use of the word education has normative implications. So, presumably, as education is of ultimate value, we cannot even ask about whether being educated leads or tends to lead to a good life, or to do so would be to assume exactly what is being denied, that is, that education has intrinsic value. The strength of Peter's claim is worth noting. He seems to be denying that education could possibly have any instrumental value.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Nama saya Aziz Duyantoko, dan di sini saya akan melanjutkan presentasi dari teman saya, Ahmad Faisal Adib. Anything we recognize as educational must involve value is a fairly uncontroversial claim. We expect people being educated to be better in some way and at something. However, when value are mentioned, it is always patient to ask whether the value involved extrinsic value that is valuable in and for itself. It is seem reasonable to assume that if there is extrinsic value, there must be some things that are intrinsically valuable. That is a list of things that are good as means must be with something that is good in and for itself. But it's not to be thought that these two categories of value are mutually exclusive. Something may be both good as it means and good in and for itself. So, for instance, someone may play squash in order to keep fit, that is as a means of to fitness, but it's also because they simply enjoy the game. One thing that goes on the above passage is a narrowing down of the conception of education, and therefore narrowing down of the type of question we can meaningfully ask about education. The distinction between education and training is interesting in this context. As I said above, Peters never denies that training may play a part of education. His point seems to be that whilst it may be a part, this part is not to be confused with the whole, but it is certainly the case that some of those influenced by Peter's took him to be saying that Will's education was a good thing by definition. Training almost certainly was not. Some earlier commentators on Peter's work note some of the problems of the educational value, and it's looking at the first passage by Peter's quotes above. Said, Peters is surely right in what he says. Vast sums of money are not spent on education simply because no other uses can be thought for it, or just for the fun of it, or in the hope of positive harm will result. In general, the money is spent on educational because people think that education is a good thing. Peter is correct that the value of education are intrinsic to education itself. That it simply misses the point to talk of education contributing to economy, social and cultural life, or well-being generally. If this so, why should we be content that vast sums of our money are spent upon it, simply to say that it is valuable in and for itself? Surely will not do. And Peter's notion quoted above, that education is of ultimate value, seems simple, hyperbole. If this means that there are no other value which can be thought to judge educational value, moral value may be such, but educational value are not. It is usually thought today that Peters was saying to do much with too. It is usually thought that today Peters was trying to do too much with too few resources. This linguistic analysis alone is not enough to either establish or defend our practice of education. But as we saw with Carr's work, the same narrow focus upon parts of education at the expense of an understanding of whole still goes on. What makes educational interesting and philosophy of educational important is that here we have an area of life where different concerns interact with one another in a complex and important ways. Philosophers of education not only examine at the basic process of education, such as teaching and learning, but also that is taught and learned, and the ways in which these things go on. They have also examined the institutional and non-institutional places where such teaching and learning may go on. Schools, university, nursery schools, the places of vocational education, such as college and workplace, and of course, home. Philosophers of education have thought and written not merely about the basic process, but also the most appropriate setting for such as process, whether, for instance, moral and religious matters are best taught at home or at schools. Whether vocational education, for example, for nurses or teachers, is best carried out in college or on the job. That is, they have examined not only what goes on and what the thing ought to go on, but also where these things should go on. They have also examined the mental underpinnings of the education, for example, intelligence and its cognites and its way understanding of things influence our understanding of education. They have also asked a question about the implication of education for the wider business of life, that is, the aim of education, and wondered whether the education can or should contribute to economy, politics, morality, cultural, and generality happiness of the population. If this is so, then any attempts to restrict their inquiries, as the example of given above, must impoverish philosophy of education, and there will be our understanding of education, such as there is a continuing tradition within philosophy of education with simply bypass some of our newspaper should convince anyone that among the topic of interest concerning current British education in our normal use of this word are the cases of educational failure I introduced at the beginning of the chapter. Other topics of recent concern are the scope of limits of education assessment and raising of the age of compulsory education, the places vocational education within schooling, faith school in a liberal democracy, and divide between state and private school. Such issues seem to me to be important, and because they are important, I expect any philosophy of education worth its name to have something to say about them. If it does not, then it is not addressing educational issue of public concern. But if it cannot, then it seems to me that the status as a philosophy of education is seriously in a risk. Saya rasa itu semua dari presentasi kelompok kami. Bila ada kesalahan dari pengetikan atau pengucapan kata-kata, saya mewakili teman-teman saya untuk memohon maaf sebesar-besarnya kepada Bapak dosen dan teman-teman semuanya. Saya rasa itu saja. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.